The Russians, because they launched a crazy war, which they're not winning, I would emphasize they are not winning, have become so dependent on China as to jeopardize their own long-term security interests.
Russia has said the Black Sea is the focus of today's talks with the US in Saudi Arabia. Yesterday, American officials met Ukraine's negotiators. Those talks focused on the energy sector after both sides accused each other of breaking an agreement not to attack energy infrastructure. Jonathan Haslam, who's with me, is a world expert on Russian foreign policy and on espionage, and his most recent book is called Hubris: The Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Well, you've been looking through the Russian papers this morning, which means you've got the jump on the rest of us. What is the feeling about these talks in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, it's not much of a jump. The first headline is the Kremlin has revealed the theme of Russia's talks with the USA and El Riyadh. The second was Putin has not removed the ban targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And three, the British don't support plans by Starmer to increase military expenditure. Those are the three items. But within the news, you can see coverage of who's leading the Russian delegation. And the head of the delegation, such as it is Grigory Karasin, who was once ambassador here in London. And his number two is, or equal number, is a guy called Sergei Besieda, who is an old KGB crony of Vladimir Putin. He's the guy who gave the false information that Ukraine would collapse in a couple of days if you invaded. So I don't know how promising that looks.
Well, let us understand a little bit about what you think is at stake in these particular talks, because both the Kremlin and the White House have had different takes on what may be at issue.
Yes. Well, it seems to be Donald Trump's strategy to work everything piecemeal, as it were. He's working into the center of the jigsaw from the edge. So having dealt with a very partial ceasefire in Ukraine just affecting energy, the next stage is to basically have a ceasefire in the Black Sea, which is where Crimea is, which is where the Russian fleet is. And this would then set the stage for a third move, which is to try to wind down military activity on the spot in Ukraine itself. So we're as it were in stage two, and obviously these stages, each of them is essential, but we're way off the major deal.
Let me understand, everyone has been saying here that Donald Trump has put himself in a position where he wants a deal much more than Vladimir Putin, and that is a weak position from which to start. But is that actually true? Do you think Putin wants a deal? Is there any will there in the Kremlin to come to a deal?
Yeah, this has been as you know, this war was supposed to end in 2 days. It's 3 years. So this war has been a disaster. The Russian economy is flat on its face. The rate of inflation is 21% and rising. There's a huge shortage of manpower, and you've got these young men going through a sausage machine in Ukraine with no end in sight. And Putin yearns for what Brezhnev and Andropov and the other Russian leaders had. He wants some sort of understandings on a global level with the United States. The Russians, because they launched a crazy war, which they're not winning, I would emphasize they are not winning, have become so dependent on China as to jeopardize their own long-term security interests. And I think they want to free themselves from the Chinese embrace in order to deal with the Americans on a more equal level.
I suppose that's up for grabs, isn't it? If you're looking at the United States' strategy as it turns towards what it clearly sees as its major adversary in China and wants to gain allies, it's in the United States' interest as well, if viewed in that way, to separate Russia from China. Do you think that is a a realistic outcome?
How realistic, I don't know, but this seems to be the strategy. I mean, Trump, you have to see the strategy against another background, which is Trump, under his Treasury Secretary, is trying to reorder the international and financial trade order in the world away from the BRICS countries, which are trying to dump the dollar. So in other words, there are a lot of pieces to this jigsaw. It's not just Ukraine. Ukraine is a major piece he's got to sort out and put in place. There's a second piece, which is Iran. If Trump can detach Putin from Iran, then he has a chance of settling questions in the Middle East on an American basis. So there's more to this than just Ukraine.
You are, I think, is widely acknowledged the preeminent historian of this particular area and of the sort of origins of these kind of events, and you've now put that down in a new book. Can you explain to us, when you say it's the origins of Russia's war against Ukraine, in a nutshell, what are those origins?
Well, the core origin is that under Bill Clinton, the Americans were pushing basically to become the dominant power in the world because Russia was on its face and China hadn't yet risen. And they set about expanding NATO, which was agreeable to certain East European countries. But within that, they included Ukraine on the list. And every Russianist in the United States, except for one who was on the National Security Council, thought this was a disastrous policy on the grounds that Russia might be on its face in 1992 to 3 to 4, but would soon get up, and then you'd have a problem. So this was a problem created by the United States. So keeping Ukraine out of NATO is the major Russian objective for these negotiations. And it looks like Trump has made absolutely clear he doesn't want Ukraine in NATO. So in other words, the negotiations can move on from there. But that was the original objective. But of course, when you start a war in this way, other things happen. And one of Putin's objectives with the United States was to keep the Americans out of Russian internal politics. And that was always a sore issue for Putin because his is a dictatorship. He doesn't want a proliferation of domestic opposition, which is what the United States have been supporting.
What about the issue of Crimea itself and the history of it? Do you think that it's there's something to Putin's claim that this is that the people there want to be part of Russia, and he's merely restoring the position that Khrushchev had agreed to, and that argument, has had some Trump administration echoes?
Yes, the key issue, as you rightly point to, I mean, the key problem with negotiating any sort of settlement of this war is Ukraine does not want to give up its eastern territories in order to regain peace with Russia. The eastern territories, the main eastern territories, are the Russian-speaking eastern areas. But Crimea is different. Crimea, you won't find a Russian who doesn't regard Crimea as Russian. It was never settled by Ukrainians. It was originally Tatar, and then it was settled by Russians at the end, Russians and Jews at the end of World War II. And Khrushchev gave it away on a whim, in fact, not going through all the legal processes. So the Russians really are fixated on getting that back. And after all, it's the home of the Russian fleet in the area, in the Black Sea. It's, an acquisition of Catherine the Great. There's a lot of history to it. The Eastern Territories, which are next to Crimea, are another matter. And I don't see Ukraine giving them up in order to get peace. And I don't see Russia giving them up easily because Putin got through legislation saying they're Russian. So to my mind, the way through there is some sort of international control, such as was done with Trieste at the end of World War II, which was contested by Italy and Yugoslavia. And that came under international supervision. I think that's the only way through so that neither side completely loses face.
I just want to come to the issue of Europe, but let's start by listening to this. This is Steve Witkoff, the United States Special Envoy to the Middle East, talking to the podcaster Tucker Carlson about Keir Starmer's plans to send troops to Ukraine. And the exchange starts with Tucker Carlson questioning the UK's military capability.
What the hell is going on with European League? Keir Starmer saying we're going to send British troops. Their entire military is smaller than the U.S. Marine Corps. The country is dying economically. All those countries are dying economically. Like, what are they thinking? What is that? Is that a posture? Is it a pose?
Well, I think it's a combination of a posture and a pose, and a combination of also being simplistic. I think there's this, this sort of notion of we've all got to be like Winston Churchill. The Russians are going to march across Europe. I think that's preposterous, by the way. We have something called NATO that we did not have in World War II.
Do you think the Russians want to march across Europe?
100% not. I think.
Right. I mean, why would they want that? I wouldn't want those countries. Like, why would they?
First of all, why would they want to absorb Ukraine? For what purpose?
Exactly.
They don't need to absorb Ukraine. That would be like occupying Gaza. Why do the Israelis really want to occupy Gaza for the rest of their lives? They don't. They want stability there.
So can I, first of all, Jonathan, just ask you about that contention of Witkoff and Tucker Carlson? He's so annoying, Tucker Carlson, that it sometimes becomes hard to actually listen to what he's saying. But might he be right on this occasion?
Yeah, I mean, Tucker Carlson is congenitally xenophobic. So get him to talk about anywhere else, it'll sound the same. But no, he does have a point, which is there's a lot of huffing and puffing. I wouldn't call it Churchillian. I mean, Churchill didn't do that sort of thing. There's a lot of huffing and puffing from Britain. You must remember that when the war occurred, Biden was like a rabbit in the headlights. Although they predicted the war, there was, almost a paralysis in Washington, and Whitehall stepped in, and the Ministry of Defense started organizing covert operations, etc., and building up more Ukrainian forces. So Britain took the initiative then and has since become a target for the FSB. I mean, we've had so many diplomats thrown out of the country because they've been hyperactive. So there's a background to that, which isn't huffing and puffing. But the point is, if you don't want NATO, you don't want NATO in Ukraine. You certainly don't want NATO peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. And it's a fundamental principle of UN peacekeeping that you have neutral countries doing the peacekeeping. In the old days, that would be Sweden, Nigeria, and countries like that. So it's a complete non-starter. I think that Boris Johnson wanted to put Britain on the map when the war occurred in Ukraine. He used it as an opportunity to put Britain, as it were, center point in Europe. I don't think that worked. And I think it was a failure in terms of possibility of peace in Ukraine. But Starmer doesn't have anywhere else to go. And I think the government's in trouble on other fronts. And Ukraine is a distraction from our economic difficulties at the moment.
Well, Jonathan Haslam, author of Hubris, The Origin of Russia's War Against Ukraine. That is now out in paperback, and as you can tell from that conversation, full of information that you want when you're trying to assess what's going on.